All right, great. So my name's Ginny Barbour. I'm the Director of Open Access Australasia. For those of you who pick up on accents, you can probably tell I'm not Australian. Well, actually, I am Australian. I just became Australian, but I'm originally from the UK, and where I work primarily in journals. So I've stepped into a very different role. I've been doing this for about 6 years now, and I work. The group Open Access Australasia is one that works across Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I'm just going to give you a really quick overview. I will try not to talk about some of the things that have come up in other presentations because there's quite a lot of similarities. So for those of you that haven't come across our group before, we're a membership organisation. We have 28 universities across Australia and New Zealand, and some non-university organisations that we also work with. And I'll just draw your attention to the fact that we have our principles are particularly relevant, I think, to this group because one of them is around equity and scholarly communication, both to access and publish research. And we strongly support a diverse ecosystem of open access approaches. So we're probably the strongest proponent in this region for repositories. And I'll come on to that in a bit. So just to say that's been a real priority for our group. So what's the state of repositories here? So I just grabbed these pictures on the right off Open Door, and you can see that essentially a couple of things happened back in the early 2000s. And for Australia, I don't, you may not, can you see my, I don't know if you can see my mouse moving, but essentially this first vertical leap was in 2006. And for New Zealand, the vertical leap also happened in around 2006. And after that, the growth was sort of incremental until a bit later on, where there were a couple of other times when it jumped. The first ones, excuse me, really jumped because because of government investment in repositories, both in Australia and New Zealand. And that was the big time when all the universities basically adopted their own repositories. The second jump, I think, was really around data repositories. It's a little hard to extract this data from Open Door, but from anecdotally, I'm pretty confident that the increase in repositories was around the data side of things rather than the research publications. So what do we have with regard to infrastructure? One of our massive challenges is the diversity of systems used. And I'll say that in particular to that, one of the things I'm quite concerned about is the way that we're moving to proprietary systems such as Pure, for example. In Australia, and I'm sure elsewhere, there's a huge issue with university rankings. And so it's absolutely critical that repositories interact with university systems, particularly those that report to government. And that's been a real challenge for us. And I would say that universities probably will prioritize the collection of data for rankings over the collection of research outputs for the sake of it, and because it's an incredibly important part of how universities get their funding. Our university repositories are not integrated into international networks, and as I said, the national investment was more than 10 years ago for both countries. So what are the good things? Well, all of the university members' libraries do have repositories, and we also know that quite a lot of other organisations do have repositories. At our Open Access Australasia, we have a directory of open access repositories, and one of the things that we know about that is that people are constantly asking us to update their information, and it provides really good visibility for the region. So what we often find, however, is that, for example, institutions such as small hospitals really have repositories that are very small and they have virtually no support associated with it. So saying, we do have an engaged community of practice, primarily practitioners, and we have a piece of work that I'm taking forward, which is to engage and develop that community of practice further this year. And the other thing just to note is pretty much all the institutions, organisations that have open access policies or approaches or open science approaches promote open access via the repository primarily. So what are our challenges? So again, they're kind of similar to many of the ones that people have talked about already. The first one, and my frustration is that government and funder mandates really have led to a failure to invest in the open repository system. We have a national research infrastructure roadmap that gets updated every few years. I've been through 2 iterations of this. We've made pretty strong applications to government in both times and simply have not had any interest in updating the infrastructure. This is quite frustrating. The good news is, well, I'm sort of hoping, we've actually got an election on Saturday, and we sort of are rather hoping that the next government might be a bit more interested. So we're holding our breath for that. There is no coordination outside of the university sector. My group, which is pretty small, so it's and has a small amount of convening power, we're trying to take that on to do more leadership there. There's issues around investment in technology and in staff. I think one of my biggest concerns right now is that we do have one of our one approach to open access in Australia that may go forward, which really doesn't understand how repositories and the need for bibliodiversity, despite our best efforts. And so we're watching that very carefully and trying to make the case constantly that we need to include repositories in any national open access approach. I've talked about the issue around academics and burgeoning workloads. And the last one, which is probably somewhat unique to this region, is that there is a real need and an appetite to include Indigenous research into our repositories. And I touched on this a bit earlier, but we're not doing it in any way that I think at this point meaningfully acknowledges that research. So what's our wish list? So a clear recognition of the role of repositories in the ecosystem, investment in the repositories, particularly staff, I would say, is a real high priority, but also in open infrastructure that supports it. I'd like to do better with national and international integration and alliances. And one of the things that we have our eye on at this point is coordinating this with the UNESCO Open Science Recommendation. And on the right, you can see this is just a document, one part of a document that we put in for the most recent election, just to kind of try and provide a visual for the need for where we have to provide investment in the scholarly publishing ecosystem and to try and sort of whet the appetite of politicians to try and take this forward. So that was it. Thanks very much.